Okay, dear colleagues, students, guests, welcome to the second lecture in the summer 2023 Sinophone Classicism series. Today we have our guest, Fangdai Chen from Lingnan University. But first, we would like to welcome the director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, Professor Dr. Matthias Lutz-Bachmann, to give his welcome speech. Please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, here in our wonderful Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, which is an institute for advanced study of Goethe University, studies in the humanities. I welcome our speaker tonight, Mrs. Fangdai Chen from Hong Kong. I'm very pleased that we could win you to present your thought on the main topic of this evening, namely the topic which is printed or has been printed here on the problem of cultural modernity and the tradition of Chinese culture in the global world. I thank Zhiyi Yang, our colleague from Goethe University. She is the responsible researcher belonging to the body of our institute. As a Goethe Fellow, she is a teaching and researching colleague here in the institute. She is responsible for the program, and it is now the fourth semester we meet in the series of Sinophone Classicism, and I'm very pleased that we can continue in that way. It is an important issue for European colleagues and universities to reflect upon the importance of the topic, the presence of Chinese culture in the modern world. And for that reason, I'm so happy that we have you here with us, offering us the possibility to reflect, to get information, and to talk about the cultural space in which the whole topic is of highest importance for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias, for the very generous speech. So now it is my honor and my delight to introduce a very young and a highly promising colleague, Fangdai Chen, who is currently Assistant Professor of Chinese Literature in Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Fangdai received her Ph.D. last June from Harvard University, advised by two world-famous scholars, David Damrosch and David Derby-Wang, two Davids. So her dissertation, The Untimely Avant-Garde, Literature, Politics, and Transculturation in the Sinosphere, 1909 to 2020, examines the artistic and political significance of Chinese or Sinophone literary avant-garde practices in dialogue with their Anglo-European counterparts from the early 20th century to the present, so combining the perspective of world literature and Sinophone literature research. While most discussions on Chinese avant-garde focuses on the art and literature since the 1980s as a response to the Maoist era, especially the discourse of the suppression and rebellion, Fangdai's research greatly expands our understanding of Chinese avant-garde by tracing its genealogy back to the era of the nationalist and the literary revolutions, and by following its transformation outside of mainland China, primarily in Sinophone communities in Taiwan and even in North America. It is currently revised for publication, I trust. Today, she will rethink and redefine the concept of the avant-garde in contemporary P.R.C. literature with regards to the emergence of variegated literary practices in the cyberspace in the recent years. Her particular focus is on the works of Chen Chuncheng, a young up-and-coming novelist. I myself read Chen Chuncheng's collection of short stories titled The Submarine at Night, 夜晚的潜水艇, last year. His literary talent is truly in the class of dazzling things that I can only describe it, for the lack of better terms, as genius. His works, while being avant-garde, are deeply inspired by Chinese classical poetic traditions. I must mention that Fangdai has played and is still playing an instrumental role in elevating Chen Chuncheng's work into the rarefied stratosphere of world literature. There is already a Spanish translation of The Submarine at Night, and an English translation will come out next year by Riverhead Books at the Penguin Group. So we hope to maybe have Chen Chuncheng here one day. So, dear Fangdai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Yang and Professor Lutz-Bachmann, for the very kind introduction. I'm very honored by the center's invitation to come here to Frankfurt and share some of my recent research findings. Actually, just a very brief footnote to Zhiyi's introduction. I worked with Professor David Wong on my dissertation, but David Dunrush, the other David, was more of a mentoring teaching for me. I taught world literature with David for quite a few semesters. I also worked with Professor Martin Puckner, who used to be, I guess he's still an expert on modernism and avant-garde studies, but he's now more tapping into the zone of world literature. So there's this very established program of world literature, both in teaching and research at Harvard at the moment. Yeah, actually, this is a very meaningful, especially meaningful visit for me because I was telling Zhiyi earlier, my last international travel before the COVID-19 pandemic started was actually to Germany. And because of the pandemic, I had to rush back to Boston from Berlin 3 years ago. So I'm very happy to be back in Germany after such a long time. And so I'm very thankful to Monica and Beate and all the staff at the center for making my trip possible in the first place. I also think there's no more perfect place than Germany to talk about the avant-garde because, as we know, some of the most important theories originated from here. So I guess it's just a very, very long-winded way of saying I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for joining us today in the room and online. I very much look forward to your comments and questions. So my talk today is actually based on an article that I contributed to the special issue that Zhiyi is co-editing with Professor David Wong of Harvard University. And I believe the issue is going to come out sometime later this year, right, in the fall or in the winter. October, yes, so look forward to that. And the topic of that special issue is Sinophone Classicism in Digital Times. My article joins that discussion by invoking the concept of the avant-garde to explore literary practices that emerge on the internet and those ones that also engage with China's classical traditions. And my goal here is twofold. First of all, I'm trying to rethink the concept and the practice of the avant-garde in the contemporary Chinese literary sphere. And secondly, I speculate that an engagement with China's classical past might actually propose an unexpected and yet very effective strategy for this redefined avant-gardism. These two questions might sound a little baffling at the moment, but please bear with me as I will make myself clearer during the remainder of my talk, which will be divided. Okay, thank you. Okay, works now. Which will be divided, my talk will be divided into the following parts. I will first address the two key concepts and contexts, namely the avant-garde and internet literature. And then I will delve into a case study, Chen Chuncheng, as Zhiyi has introduced, a very young but emerging writer in mainland China at the moment. I take Chen as a prime example that best demonstrates this intersection between the avant-garde, internet literature, and classicism. So without further ado, oh, it's not working again. It's, yeah. Okay, there we go, yeah. So yeah, without further ado, let me start with the first concept, the avant-garde. When we hear the word the avant-garde, right, especially in Anglo-European context, we often immediately think of the cultural movements that emerged in the early 20th century in Europe, right, such as Futurism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. These are canonized as the historical avant-garde, and then they share the following traits. Most of them reached their climactic development during the interwar period, right, during the two world wars. And secondly, they developed such groundbreaking aesthetics that they dismantled what people used to understand as what art and literature should look like. And lastly, many of these avant-gardists carried very radical socio-political ideologies, right? So the Dadaists were an anti-war group to start with. And then the Surrealists, as some of you may know, were very eager to join hands with the Communist Party. So because of their artistic innovations and socio-political dispositions, the historical avant-garde in the Anglo-European context is considered by some scholars as a radical version, the most radical version of modernism. But when we talk about the word the avant-garde, right, some of us might also think of the Neo-Avant-Garde, which appeared in the 1960s, and this time mostly as an art historical term. So the historical avant-garde worked on literature and art and various kinds of media, but then the Neo-Avant-Garde is mostly in the art sphere. And they specifically refers to the second wave of the avant-garde in the art world, such as movements, abstract expressionism, pop art, neo-dada, the list goes on and on. And the prefix neo here implies that the second wave of avant-gardists in a way revived the aesthetic innovations of the first wave, which is the historical avant-garde. The difference is, however, the center of these avant-gardist activities shifted from continental Europe to North America, mainly New York City, right? And this was a result of the world wars, and then America became this new rising economic power. And because of that reason, some scholars, such as the German critic Peter Berger, thinks that the neo-avant-garde had come to embrace the capitalist market, which the historical avant-garde once tried to defy. In other words, Berger criticizes the neo-avant-garde for only retaining the aesthetic agenda of the historical avant-garde, but having lost its socio-political aspirations because they became complicit in the totalization of capitalism in the cultural industry. And this position was actually echoed by many others, right? Such as the French thinker Roland Barthes, who in 1970 famously said, I quote, "Today it seems that we're watching the avant-garde slowly die. The bourgeois is reoccupying it," end quote. This is not only a death sentence for the avant-garde, but also for avant-garde studies. In today's cultural and literary studies, we rarely talk about the avant-garde except for using the term more generically, right, to describe a kind of innovative style, or perhaps to cast a nostalgic gaze upon these historical and neo-avant-gardes who kind of disappear from the center stage of the art and literary worlds. If we turn to the Chinese literary sphere, we see a very similar situation. The avant-garde seems to have become a bygone era in Chinese literary history. The term the avant-garde was already being used in the 1930s and 40s in China by some of the literary journals, such as this one, Literary and Artistic Avant-Garde, 文艺先锋. And these journals were mostly leftist or proletarian journals. And however, even though the term was already used by these writers, the avant-garde as a concept in Chinese cultural studies almost exclusively refers to this group of writers who emerged in the 1980s. They're the writers who churned out fictional works that boldly challenge the past modes of literary writing in the Chinese tradition. And this seminal group includes many names that Chinese literature lovers are probably very familiar with, right? Ma Yuan, Can Xue, Yu Hua, Su Tong, Ge Fei, and lastly, our Nobel Prize, our 2012 Nobel Prize winner, Mo Yan, is considered a late member of the avant-garde school group as well. So these writers, they experimented with linguistic conventions and narrative structures in ways that completely overthrew the system of socialist realism, which had dominated the literary sphere in China for the past decades. They took the liberty to turn toward the medium of literature itself and tested its innovative limits. This common ethos earned them a collective label of the avant-garde school, Sinophone Pai. It is worth noting that besides the time difference between the European avant-gardes, right, and for the first wave in the early 20th century and then the Neo-Avant-Garde in the 1960s, the Chinese seem to come a little later, right, in the 1980s and 90s. Besides this time difference, there's also another huge difference, which is that the Chinese avant-gardes never actually formed an organized coterie, such as the Dadaists or the Surrealists. Even though they were labeled as the avant-garde school, they never actually formed an organization themselves. Instead, they each embarked on their own expeditions. And this leads to two observations. First of all, under the collective label of the avant-garde school, a very diverse range of literary experimentations were actually being carried out. And secondly, the avant-garde in the Chinese context is a very loosely defined term that in fact points to extremely individualized interventions. And similar to so that was the difference, right? But then the similarity is similar to the Anglo-European avant-garde. The Chinese avant-garde gradually came to an end, to the end of their heyday, when an emerging mass culture arose in the late 1990s. And this was a result of China's economic reform and open door policy. So as a result, the pure literature or highbrow literature, as the ones produced by the avant-garde school writers, lost their popularity among cultural consumers in China. And many of these avant-garde writers actually turned to writing the so-called new historical novels, 新历史小说, as realism made its very powerful comeback in the Chinese literary sphere. So from the historical narratives that I just told, right, it seems that the avant-garde is not very relevant in whichever context of our concern. So why am I still talking about it today, right? I will address that question in a little bit, but before that, I must lay the foundation, another foundation by introducing internet literature in China as well. Internet literature in China, it's not a new phenomenon anymore, right? As it is not in many parts of the world. We virtually live on the internet most of our time. And internet literature actually as an academic field now is very expensive and relatively well established. If you're interested in finding out more, Professor Michelle Hawk's book, Internet Literature in China, I believe it came out in 2015. This book is a great read if you want to find out more. But for today, I am just going to give a very diluted version of its history. The earliest Chinese internet literary works could be dated back to 1991 when this an online journal called China News Digest, shortened as CND, 华夏文摘, began to publish prose, poetry, and fiction in the Chinese language. And this is actually a screenshot of their current web portal. I just accessed it last week. So it actually still retains a lot of this kind of the millennial turn kind of aesthetics here, right? It's not one of those really contemporary web design. So this inception of Chinese literature, Chinese internet literature, was actually very diasporic and transcultural in nature, because most of the contributors back then were Chinese students studying abroad in the United States. And I'm going to quote from a 2012 article These Chinese students express their feelings of homesickness by writing and reading articles in Chinese. They also access the journal or the site to get news from China because it republished articles from Chinese newspapers and magazines, end quote. In other words, the emergence of Chinese internet literature testifies to the cyberspace's distinctive capacity to disseminate textual information and composition across national borders. It also emerged as a digital manifestation of this pressing yearning for an affirmative Chineseness, affirmative experience of Chineseness, and then also the subsequent reconnection with and recreation of a Chinese identity among diasporic communities. By 2016, the online Chinese literature community had grown to encompass 297 million users, which is about 43.1% of all China's internet users. So it's a very great number. And it also has a very wide range of literary productions, from grassroots poetry to various genres of fiction. And this kind of wide range proves that the cyberspace has the capacity to host heterogeneous cultural representations. And the internet literature, if you remember when the Chinese avant-garde school began to sort of, when their heyday began to end, it was in the 1990s, right? And internet literature began to appear in the early 90s as well. So we actually see a very brief kind of time overlap, a historical overlap between these two contexts. And this overlap, it has actually been spotted by Michelle Hawkes as well, who takes an interest in this writer called Chen Chuncheng. So Chen Chuncheng is a Hui ethnic mainland Chinese writer, and he wrote a lot of experimental fiction about the so-called Sandang youth experience. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term Sandang youth or Zhiyi in Chinese, these were mainly the young people who were sent to the rural areas for educational reform during the Cultural Revolution. So Chen Chuncheng wrote about this experience and really experimented with the form of fictional writing. And because of that, he was also considered as part of the avant-garde school writers. And Chen Chuncheng also was one of the earliest writers to begin writing on the internet. So Michelle Hawkes actually thinks that in internet writing, this writer also keeps alive the avant-garde school spirit by maintaining an anti-market and anti-establishment attitude. I certainly agree with Hawkes' observation of this avant-garde literature's unfinished presence past the millennial term, right, which helps make the case for why we still need to talk about the avant-garde today. But however, I also want to add that perhaps a more important reason to talk about the avant-garde today has to do with challenging our conventional understanding of the avant-garde literature's of sort of thinking of the avant-garde as a very radical and progressive literary project. Instead, I observed that in today's China cyberspace, there's a kind of literary avant-gardism that no longer outwardly promotes radical revolutionism, but adopts a more sophisticated and adaptable aestheticism. This aestheticism is nevertheless highly rebellious. It is so rebellious that it even goes against its own long-standing status as a progressive and revolutionary scheme. Or to borrow our very own Professor Zhiyi Yang's words on this relevant concept of avant-garde classicism, which will be the focus of the second part of my talk. I quote Zhiyi, we may envision a kind of avant-garde classicism that rejects relentless progressivism and revolutions as another status quo, end quote. But in order to establish this renewed understanding of avant-gardism in contemporary Chinese literature, we must first return to the term, the avant-garde itself. So the avant-garde was originally a French military term, right, for the most advanced corps of an army, They're the ones who stand at the very forefront, who lead others into the decided direction of this military march. And the two terms that have been used to translate the avant-garde into Chinese, 先锋 and 前卫, actually also had very similar associations in ancient China. 先锋 can be traced back as early as to records of Hanji, which is a 2nd century text. And 前卫 was recorded as being first used in the Yuan dynasty, during the Yuan dynasty, so 13th century. And these terms, both of them actually meant military vanguards, so exactly the same as the French term. And the French term, the avant-garde, acquired a symbolic meaning during the 19th century in Europe, and it came to refer to cultural figures with the most advanced ideologies and practices. They most often appear when the past modes of thought and expression are in crisis. So if we think back to the historical avant-gardes, right, they appeared after industrialization and during the wartime. So that was a very representative case. Same is also true for the Chinese avant-garde school, because in the 1980s and 90s, China was going through very drastic socio-political changes. From this etymological tracing, we realize that the avant-garde has actually very vast conceptual potential once we liberate it from the limited context within which it has been largely discussed. The cultural avant-garde is essentially someone who first discerns the urgencies of his or her time and intervenes in such urgencies with aesthetic innovations. And there are two defining characteristics of this cultural avant-gardism. First of all, these people hold a very acute temporal sensitivity because they're the ones to take the first leap into the future from the present, but they must do so with an understanding, a very profound understanding of the past. Secondly, they hold a resolute belief in the power and potential of cultural creations. And in the case of the literary avant-garde, this cultural creation is none other than literature itself. With this in mind, let us now turn to my case study today, Chen Chuncheng. I believe most of you are probably hearing the name for the very first time today, and it is for a very legit reason. He's very young and new, as Zhiyi introduced, and has not been translated widely into foreign languages. But as Zhiyi mentioned, a Spanish translation is already in the pipeline, as I know, and there might be an English one coming as well. Actually, it was not supposed to be announced, but it's fine. It is our hope that this will come out next year. So Chen Chuncheng, so who is he? He is an immature writer who first started writing on the platform Douban, which is the most popular online platform for film and literature lovers. Chen Chuncheng actually is an engineering major graduate who used to work for a botanical garden in southern China. So he was really not a professional writer to begin with. So on Douban, he began self-publishing, and it was in 2017, so actually not very long time ago either. Another considerable feature of internet literature that I didn't get to talk about earlier is its low barriers, its low bar to participation, expression, and dissemination, right? Anybody can go online and register an account and just start writing. And Chen Chuncheng definitely benefits from this low barrier feature as an amateur writer who had no association with the commercial publishing industry. And Chen's works, filled with refreshing imagination and written in an extremely refined language, quickly caught the attention of publishing professionals in China. In 2020, his first work collection, The Submarine at Night, 夜晚的潜水艇, the book that Zhiyi read, came out in 2020. and it quickly became one of the best-selling books of the year. And this was followed by a traditional version published in Taiwan in 2021. Not only was this book selling very well, but it also actually went on to win many prizes. One example is it was being selected as one of the 2020 top 10 fictional works by this very influential Hong Kong-based journal called Asia Weekly, 亚洲周刊. Chen Chuncheng's experience conforms to that of many other internet literature writers in China who translated their online popularity into a very successful career in print literature. However, what distinguishes Chen Chuncheng from others is this very peculiar condition that all of the pieces included in the print book were for free on the platform Douban, and actually remained so for many months after the print book came out. And also in a private conversation that I had with the writer, he actually told me that he made very, very little revision to the pieces that he started publishing online in 2017 when they became the print version. So in other words, all the while when people could actually access this writing for free online, Chen's book still was selling exceedingly well. This very intriguing popular circulation of his works across the online and offline, and therefore digital and physical boundaries, became a kind of meta demonstration of the writer's conception of literature's existential condition, which will be the main focus of the second part of my talk. But sort of back to why he has become so popular. At first glance, what makes Chen stand out is his very ingenious literary imagination that transcends boundaries of history, tradition, and space. For instance, the namesake novella, The Submarine at Night, portrays this unbelievable encounter between a submarine built in a teenager's imagination and a submarine employed by an Australian tycoon to search for a coin tossed by the Argentinian writer Borges. And this lost Borges coin is then paralleled by a 500-year-old Chinese stone tablet mysteriously concealed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution in this following piece, Bamboo Teak Temple. And then in this very funnily titled piece, The Tale of Cloud Tailoring, the protagonist works for this absurd National Cloud Management Bureau, which controls the shapes of the cloud that we see every day in the sky. And then this last piece, called The Musician, it tells the story of this, of the disappearance of this extraordinary musical piece on a rainy night in Leningrad in 1957. So as we can see, there's a huge, very diverse range of highly imaginative stories, right, in one single collection. So imagination kind of became the keyword in all of these complements for Chen Chuncheng's works. However, I contend that there's a more profound reason behind his popularity, which is Chen's very perceptive discernment of the latest mental malaise of today's world, and his philosophical deliberation on how to resolve such malaise. And he does so by reflecting on this dialectics of cang, concealment, and dissemination, chuan, in a world where rapidly changing external circumstances furthers the impossibility of certitude and reliability. But Chen proposes that perhaps to conceal is to disseminate. In this piece, Bamboo Teak Temple, I briefly introduced, the protagonist hides his old house key next to the stone tablet under concealment since the Cultural Revolution. And this exclusive knowledge of the little object's concealment provides him with a tremendous amount of peace in such a chaotic world. And the protagonist takes peace in knowing that his key will be passed down secretly in history until the moment that it is called to reveal itself, only to inspire another gesture of concealment, just like the stone tablet did for him. Chen extends this dialectical reflection on concealment and dissemination to the very existence of literature by engaging with China's classical traditions. Chen's work frequently travels back into the historical, but more oftentimes the fictional past of Chinese literary and intellectual traditions. The most evident example is his appropriation of the 18th century novel Dream of the Red Chamber, 红楼梦, in this novella called A Mass for Dream of the Red Chamber, 红楼梦弥撒. Similarly, in the piece, The Magic Pen, 传彩笔, it is a reference to the tale of the poet Jiang Yan, which is recorded in History of the Southern Dynasty's Nanshi, a 7th century history book. And Bamboo Teak Temple, a piece that's going to come up again and again. It's actually my favorite piece of the collection. Bamboo Teak Temple presents with impressive details a completely fictional Ming Dynasty text titled Jottings from the Upturned Boat Mountain Lodge, 富船山房随笔. It with such impressive details. The first time I read it, I really thought it was a real Ming Dynasty text, and then I really had to look it up, and then there was no way to find it, and then I realized, oh, this is actually made up by the writer. Yeah. So Chen Chuncheng's work frequently engages with China's classical past, right? And therefore, it definitely participates in the undertaking of what our Professor Yang brilliantly proposed as Sinophone Classicism. I'm going to quote Zhiyi again. It refers to the appropriation, redeployment, and reconfiguration of cultural memories, invoking Chinese aesthetic and intellectual traditions for local, contemporary, and vernacular uses by agents identified or self-identified as Chinese, end quote. Actually, modern and contemporary Chinese writers' intertextual engagement with the classical traditions is not without precedence. A famous example is the arguably most famous modern Chinese writer Lu Xun's 1936 book, Old Stories Retold, in which he rewrites mythologies, legends, and personal accounts of ancient Chinese philosophers. And this was very much part of his project of searching for a new Chinese modernity. And more recently, the former avant-garde school writer Su Tong also contributed a modernized tale of the very well-known historical figure Lady Mengjiang, Mengjiang Nu. And this book is titled Bi Nu and the Great Wall. So he changed the name of Lady Mengjiang to Bi Nu. And this book, interestingly, was actually published in the Canongate Myth series, which was a world literature project conceived in 1999 by the namesake Scottish publisher. And the project's goal was to revive ancient myth from diverse cultures. So how is Chen Chuncheng's Sinophone Classicism different? I think it stands out because it demonstrates a very radical reimagination and reconstruction of the temporal and material conditions of literary text existence. In returning to China's classical tradition, Chen is not simply reviving a cultural memory from the past. Instead, he conflates the past, the future, the past of the future, and the future of the past of a literary text by proposing a new answer to the question, what does it mean for literature to exist, for literary writing to exist? In doing so, Chen proposes an anachronism that reveals the multiple temporalities belonging to and made possible by literary writing. It is in this anachronism that Chen reveals his potential as a literary avant-garde who holds an unyielding belief in literature's transcendental power. Chen begins his exploration of literature's existential condition in the piece, The Magic Pen. The novella, so Chen's novella tells the story of a writer who is the protagonist, who one day was gifted a magic pen, And the pen enables him to compose the greatest literary works in the world. This is definitely a reference to, as I mentioned before, the story of the poet Jiang Yan recorded in the history of the Southern dynasties. So the history of the Southern dynasties is the 80-volume huge historical history book that includes Jiang Yan's story. Jiang Yan, Jiang Yan reportedly lost all of his literary talent and could no longer write poetry after returning his pen to a mysterious figure in his dream. And in Chen's novella, this dilemma of owning the magic pen transforms into a new paradoxical condition. The work written with this magic pen is so incomparable that only the writer himself can see and read it. In other words, the protagonist's paramount literary achievement would remain unknown to the rest of the world when he holds the pen. The pen, therefore, connotates both a blessing and a curse. And more importantly, this condition calls into the question of the physical subsistence of literature. At the end of the story, the protagonist takes out his notebook only to see blankness on those pages. However, he knows that the words that he has written down will reveal themselves once the notebook is closed and concealed from other human eyes. I quote, "In darkness, the words simply glow. I put the notebook under my pillow and caress it before bed. I lie upon the entire universe that I almost came to possess, and then I fall asleep into the trivial dreams that I have every day." End quote. Is the existence of literature, its formation, revelation, and dissemination, subject to the preservation of its material form? Can literature now outlive its physical presentation by alternative means of memory? The pen and the writing that the protagonist produces with it have perished, but its phantasmal remnants continue to sustain a formidable cosmos in the protagonist's life and to symbolize the possibility of transcending the mediocrity and the impasse of every day. This suggestive proposal of literature's transcendental survival finds a more radical iteration in A Mass for Dream of the Red Chamber, 红楼梦弥撒. As one of the 4 best-known classic Chinese novels, Dream of the Red Chamber depicts the decline of the once prosperous aristocratic Jia clan, Jia Fu, in imperial China, and also the concurrent downfall of this indeterminate dynasty during which Jia Fu existed. Chen Chuncheng takes advantage of the genre of science fiction to situate the classic novel in the fictional future of the 49th century. In the 49th century, the entire planet Earth has come to be ruled by the global president named Jiao Datong. This peculiar name, Jiao Datong, actually alludes to a minor character in Dream of the Red Chamber, Jiao Da, who used to be the most senior servant in the Jia clan. But then he came to be treated maliciously by the younger generations of the Jia masters. As a result, Jiao Da makes one of the earliest announcements of the clan's eventual downfall in the story. Meanwhile, Jiao Da also brings to mind the concept of great unity, establishing classical Chinese philosophy as a utopian vision of a world where everything and everyone coexist peacefully. Therefore, in the name of Jiao Datong, we perceive this contradictory notion of unity and prosperity on the one hand, and ruination and annihilation on the other hand. In the novella, President Jiao Datong eagerly seeks to restore Dream of the Red Chamber, which by all accounts began to disappear from physical records and people's memories around the First Star War. Remember that we're in the 49th century now. And for this scheme, President Zhao's regime hunts down the protagonist, who is the oldest human being on planet Earth, and he was born in the era before the novel began to disappear. So therefore, he becomes the only person who has read the novel in its entirety. And then because he drank this alcohol, he remained asleep for thousands of years, which is why he was still alive. And he's still alive in the 49th century. So that's Chen Chuncheng is the protagonist name. So it's just to sidetrack a little bit. You will see that in Chen Chuncheng's writing, most of the protagonists have the last name Chen, which is this little joke that he actually plays by sort of putting his own last name into the writing. So the president's government was really trying to hunt down this protagonist, right, in order to retrieve Dream of the Red Chamber. Meanwhile, another organization called the Redology Society, Hongxue, literally a society for the study of the dream of red chambers, Honglongmeng Xuehui. And this society is also hunting down the protagonists. And this society consists of people who worship the text as a sacred scripture. And also, just another side note, and a real organization called the Chinese Society of Dream of the Red Chambers actually exists. It's now an auxiliary to the Chinese National Academy of Arts. And supposedly it was founded in 1980 and now has more than 300 members. However, it is unclear if Chen Chuncheng had this in mind when he was writing his piece. So in the novella, when they were hunting down, when both parties are hunting down the protagonists, they review sort of their why they're doing so. And the global president's government holds the belief that, I quote, according to some evidence, a theory, a formula, or a dictum may be hidden in Dream of the Red Chamber. Some believe that it could unleash an invincible power when applied to political governance, economic development, and scientific advancement, end quote. So this is the global president's government. And the Redology Society also holds their belief, which is, I quote, I apologize, I know this is very long, but it's all very important. I'm going to read the English translation. Dream of the Red Chamber is the meaning of the universe. According to the society's doctrine, there is an unseen thread that weaves together everyone's fates. It was initiated in the chaos before the formation of the universe, discreetly wreathed all events and all objects, and extends throughout the ages. It was kindled at its incipient moment, and the spark continuously pushed forward through every dynasty and every generation until the moment when Dream of the Red Chamber was completed. They call this moment the red point, 红点. And then, kaboom, the universe reached its most glorious acme. After that, there's only the long downfall and the long downhill and the slow downfall. Dream of the Red Chamber began to perish upon its completion, and when it completely disappears, the universe will also vanish accordingly, end quote. I think this is one of the, for me, one of the climax of the novella, a very well-written passage. So when we really compare the Redology Society's belief to the global president's regime's belief, we see that their mania for the text cannot be better summarized than a type of textual fundamentalism, which is reflected in a rigid or even literalist attachment to the letters and dogmas of scriptures, and as we can see in many religious practices, right? In other words, Chen's fictionalized account of the Chinese classic novel forms a parallel with the biblical tradition in the West, where a text as logos dictates the ultimate truth of all things. However, upon a closer look, especially in the Redology Society's, let me go back, in the Redology Society's belief, we see a paradox embedded in this textual fundamentalism. This textual fundamentalism is first of all premised upon the continuous involvement of the novel. However, the novel itself is evolving only to come to its complete obliteration. One could argue that the society's ultimate commitment to Dream of the Red Chamber takes the form of a resolute nihilism toward the future of mankind and the universe. But I argue that this life-death paradox, in fact, reveals the most radical part of Chen Chuncheng's anachronistic view of literature and literary history. Namely, Dream of the Red Chamber obtains its omnipresent and internal life in the dissolvement and obliteration of its physical existence. As a matter of fact, the title, A Mass for Dream of the Red Chamber, already gives away Chen's double meanings behind the use of the word mass. And he explains this in the afterwords to the piece. I quote, "Mass in the title refers to the most lofty ritual in Catholicism. It is also a genre of religious music. I take this novella as a dedication or an ode to Dream of the Red Chamber. Later, I learned that missa, the Latin original, also means to dissolve, to depart. So it happens to echo the vanishing of Dream of the Red Chamber," end quote. In other words, through the Redology Society, the author conveys the message that the ultimate worship of the novel takes the form of an affirmative acknowledgement of the decomposition of its materiality. This dissolvement, in fact, becomes an emancipation because in divesting itself of the physical evidence of its existence, literature turns against history's endeavor to canonize it, to interpret it, to translate it, and to demand its service for any specific juncture and agents other than literature itself. In dissolving, Chen Chuncheng's Dream of the Red Chamber testifies to the Frankfurt School philosopher Herbert Marcuse's very provocative 1977 statement, I quote, "The radical qualities of art are grounded precisely in the dimension where art transcends its social determination and emancipates itself from the given universe of discourse and behavior while preserving its overwhelming presence," end quote. In the case of Dream of the Red Chamber, its overwhelming presence becomes all the more overwhelming as it loses its corporeal existence. This counterintuitive logic also reaffirms Chen Chuncheng's dialectical reflection on concealment and dissemination that I talked about earlier. If you still remember, in the piece Bamboo Teak Temple, there's this hidden key, right? And then the hidden stone tablet. And this key that is hidden under the stone tablet kind of becomes a secretive victory against modernity. In other words, the concealment of the key enables its autonomous and exclusive preservation against the ticking clock of the modern era and the irreversible passing of this progressive agenda of modernity, right? So he's really playing with this idea of existing and disappearance, and that sort of provides mobility in terms of literature's temporality. This vision is testified by a minor school within the Redology Society, which actually questions the society's main doctrine. Instead of an ultimate death, the text dispersion or disappearance are only part of its cycle of life that is not subjugated to historical time and to literature's physical medium. I quote, "Dream of the Red Chamber is a qi-like matter, which roams over the world, converges into words, and then gradually dissolve into all things on earth again," end quote. So qi, right, if you know Chinese medicine, it's a very fundamental concept in Chinese medicine philosophy. It refers to a life force, a vital energy that circulates around but cannot be seen. In this interpretation, the novel, Dream of the Red Chamber becomes an ethereal being that periodically manifests in the corporeal form of words. And in the latter half of the novella, we see various announcements of fragments of Dream of the Red Chamber being found on Earth. Chen Chuncheng gives, again, very imaginatively gives a series of examples. So some report that Dream of the Red Chamber, parts of it are carved inside a jade stone, are found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and sentences are altered by a panda who somehow just can speak all of a sudden. They're also hidden in the pattern of a butterfly's wing and then in the rosy clouds of down. So very, very imaginative again. And this dissolving and re-emerging of the text embodies what the 19th century German dramatist, I'm quoting a lot of Germans today, it is not intentional, Georg Büchner says, I quote, "An infinite beauty that passes from form to form, internally changed and revealed fresh," end quote. The most intense corporeal embodiment of the novel, however, is the protagonist himself. The protagonist Chen Chuncheng, after surviving imprisonment by both the global president's regime and the Radiology Society, comes to read over and over again in his brain the entirety of the novel that was resuscitated through his memory. He reads it so much that the novel the novel comes to fully occupy his consciousness. Eventually, the protagonist dies peacefully, knowing that he has experienced the best part of what the novel has to offer. And then the novel will come to live on as he has passed down its title to the narrator who stumbles upon him in his final moments. He says, "The title is also part of the novel," end quote. And then after that, as I mentioned before, the very last line of the novella just lists more discoveries of the novel's fragments being found all over the planet Earth. Whether the novel's final obliteration will take place eventually and lead to the destruction of the entire universe remains unknown. The novel just ends before telling us if that ever happens. But Chen Chuncheng has had us, the reader of this novella, bear witness to the ever-present and ubiquitous existence of literature. We then come to realize that the most radical aspect of his 49th century Dream of the Red Chamber lies not in its conflation of historical past and imaginative future, but in the reconceptualization of its temporality as one that cannot be pinned down by the passing of historical time. And I'm just quoting actually from my own article that's going to come out. In its cycles of birth and rebirth, the classic text symbolizes literature's overcoming of time and of its binding responsibility to any concrete historical moment and its prescribed cultural and socio-political functions. When we look back at how Chen Chuncheng first started writing, it was on the internet, right? And it is not a coincidence that the cyberspace serves as the genesis and nexus of his portrayal of literature's transcendental mobility. The internet has become a vitally important alternative platform where literary traces disseminate as a qi-like matter that takes concrete forms when the time calls for it, and then dissolves when the moment passes, but never fully disappears. It continues to live in spirit and will arise again when another historical juncture calls for it. And when we connect Chen Chuncheng's conceptualization of literature's temporality and materiality to his philosophical reflection on this modern malaise that I mentioned of today's world, we come to realize that literature as an existence that transcends all boundaries, restrictions, and limitations become the perfect remedy for those who feel agitated and confined by the latest condition of modern life. For this reason, while Chen Chuncheng's writing reflects none of the progressive revolutionism of, say, the historical avant-garde or the Chinese avant-garde school, his writing is nevertheless revolutionary in another sense. I'm going to borrow Marcuse's words again. I quote, "Against all fetishism of the productive forces, against the continued enslavement of individuals by the objective conditions which remain those of domination, art represents the ultimate goal of all revolutions, the freedom and the happiness of the individual." End quote. That is all from me today. Thank you.